Hi, my name is Suiyue Cui, and I am taking the Global Environmental Health class with NYU Global Public Health, and it is spring semester 2019, and I'm going to talk about the gas tragedy in Bhopal, India. So I will first introduce the purpose and the objective of the presentation, and I'm going to introduce the context of the situation of the gas leak and the context of the methyl isocyanate gas leak, and also the distribution of the MIC exposure and what's MIC's poisoning's effect on human health. And I'm also going to touch on the aftermath of the factory owners and the government after the event, and the ongoing contaminations in the site of the disaster and the social influence of the disaster. So the purpose of the presentation is to talk about the so-called gas tragedy, which is gas leakage happened in 1980 December the 2nd to December the 3rd in 1984 in Bhopal, India. What happened was about 40 tons of vaporized liquid methyl isocyanate escaped from the storage and caused a very massive casualty to the local residents. And the context of that situation, the factory's name was Union Carbide India Limited. It is a pesticide plant in Bhopal, in the city of Bhopal in province Madhya Pradesh in India. The main event happened in December the 2nd to December the 3rd in 1984, but starting from 1981, there has been some minor leakage reported. It wasn't paid attention by the management of the factory, but it was reported after the tragedy happened. What was leaked was about 40 tons of vaporized liquid MIC liquid. It's methyl. The full name is methyl isocyanate, and the direct cause of the leakage was the malfunctioning of factory safety devices and the improper storage of MIC. And the And what happened was 40 tons of MIC liquid was released within hours, while most of the residents was asleep, were asleep. And MIC, when it's a very poisonous when absorbed by human. The most major way of human taking in MIC was through inhalation, and the acute effect that happened from the moment they inject, people inhale MIC to up to 6 months of was ocular chemosis, ulcers, and photophobia, and respiratory distress, pulmonary edema, pneumonosis, persistent diarrhea, anorexia, abdominal pain, and neurosis, anxiety, and other neurobehavioral impairment. And the long-term effect includes conjunctivitis, obstructive and restrictive airway diseases, decreased lung function, increased pregnancy loss, such as and increased infant mortality, decreased fetal weight, and increased chromosomal abnormalities, and decreased motor speed, and learning impairment. And distribution of this MIC exposure has caused this exposure has caused more than 3,000 died within hours. Most of them died. A lot of them died in their sleep, and a lot of people also lost their sights. And this organization, an international organization, Amnesty International, has estimated 7,000 to 10,000 people has died within 3 days of the disaster, and another 15,000 to 20,000 died about 20 within the 20 years, within around 18 years from the within 18 years after the incidents. There is no official number of the casualty. All the numbers listed here were estimates from the cohort study that followed 80,000 people conducted by Indian Medical Association, and it is also estimated that more than 500,000 people were exposed to MIC. And right now, 20 years after the disaster, 120,000 people lived with the damage or disability caused by the disaster, caused by the exposure. And there are studies with living and dead exposees show that there were high levels of kyanate and some evidence of binding of MIC to circulating hemoglobin in the body. And there are also thousands of animals like cattle and dogs perished after the leakage. As for the factory owner and the government, the owner UCC, they have attempted to dissociate from their responsibility, they did some things, including stating the plant was all the responsibility of the operating the plant was all on its Indian subsidiary. They also try to blame the Sikh extremist to try to let people try to claim the accident was actually a conspiracy. The first lawsuit was filed in a U.S. court with very little attention on the aftermath of the Indian local victims. And later on, the Indian government decided to represent all the injured parties in the courts, both in America and in India. And settlement by Indian Supreme Court deemed the owner UCC moral responsibility and $470 million fine to Indian government for later settlement for the actual victims. But when we refer to the similar cases that happen in America, like the occupational health contamination cases, the fine was actually so much higher than in this one. And UCC still withheld the scientific data to the hazard. It later discontinued the plant, but they also failed to clean up the industrial site. The plant kept on leaking toxic chemicals and heavy metals. And this led to our ongoing the current situation and the ongoing contamination and social influence of this incident. There were increased number of stillborn in local women, increased pregnancy losses and increased infant mortalities. And there are thousands of people was left to live with disability, and there are toxic remains of UCC factory which has contaminated the underground the groundwater and subsoil. And the local victims felt left out while there are for two decades after the event, there are no study with a very high public health value conducted to find out about the possible health effect on the local population. And pollution data and accurate death toll is still not released by the owner and the government. And there, what we have now are estimates, and it's very hard to estimate exactly how bad this incident has hit the town. Okay, this is a graph of Bhopal and national figure comparison of reproductive health around a year after the event. We can see in Bhopal there are in all these categories, Bhopal has a much higher rate than the national average. In a spontaneous abortion rate, it's about three times of the national range, and in infant mortality rate, it's about 2 times. So there's definitely an exhibited increase of pregnancy losses and infant mortality. And there's here is one figure about in Bhopal, about pregnancy in Bhopal before the hazard and after. You can see we can see an instant elevated pregnancy losses and perinatal and neonatal mortality after the hazard. And here is a comparison of groups of pediatric population. They are recruited by a study that recruited children with coughing, with signs of coughing after the incidents. So there are two groups of the children. There are some are within 0.5 to 2 kilometers to the factory, and 8 to 10 kilometers to the factory. And we can see that the children who live closer to the factory has a higher chance of having eye problems or abnormal respiratory symptoms than the children who live further from the factory. So the disaster is, to summarize this presentation, the disaster of Bhopal gas leakage was deadly on local population, and there are long-term health effects found in the survivors and the second generation, like the kids who were born after the disaster. And pollution, chemical pollution, is still a problem in Bhopal today. The factory site was not cleaned, so the chemicals are the chemicals and the heavy metals are contaminating the water and the soil. It's a problem that needs to be resolved. And there are some follow-up and investigation to be done to the health on the local population who has been through the disaster back in the 1980s. So it's been 30 years. So we still need some details on what exactly happened on that day, in that night. Okay, thank you.